Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I want to make sure, first of all, that everybody at the back can hear clearly.
Yes.
Good, good. Thank you. It's a very nice room. It's nice to be here. It's my first time in Turkey. I was explaining to someone yesterday that I've traveled to 42 different countries for Cambridge, and for some reason Turkey was not one of them. So country number 43 now is Turkey, and I'm very pleased to be here. I arrived yesterday and I've only seen a little bit from my hotel, but I have a beautiful view of the sea, and behind me is a magnificent mosque, so it all looks very wonderful, and old city walls. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to talk for about 45 or 50 minutes, and that's what I was doing with my phone. I wasn't checking my email, I was setting a timer so to remind myself when to stop. But if I just go on and don't take any notice of it, please somebody do that. You know, so I'm quite capable of talking all day. Now, the subject I'm going to talk about is fluency. And I want to explain why this is interesting for me. It's interesting because I work in the language teaching profession. But there's another reason why it's interesting, and that is that the people out there, the general public, when they talk about language, they don't use the same kinds of terminology and words that we use when we talk about language. But one word that they do use, which we have in common with them, is the word fluency and fluent and fluently. So you'll hear people saying, oh, my sister speaks fluent Spanish, or she's absolutely fluent in Japanese. You don't hear people saying, she has such wonderful collocations in Japanese. That's not part of the vocabulary of the general public, but fluency is. Somehow it is embedded in the minds of ordinary people. So we have a duty to understand it as professionals, to try and see it from their point of view. That's one reason. Then, of course, there are other reasons, which we shall examine more closely now. So first of all, what is fluency? Now, as I go around the world to these 43 countries, I always ask people, what is the word in your language which translates the English word fluent or fluently?
Clothing.
So Turkish is? And it doesn't mean something that flows. It's very interesting. Almost everywhere in the world, no matter what the language is, the translation of the English word fluent in relation to language has the same meaning of something flowing like a river. The only exception so far is the language of my own native country, Wales, and the Welsh language has a word, rhugyd, terrible word to pronounce, and it means rattling, rattling. But sometimes in English we say, she was rattling away in Spanish. So the idea of something rattling is not too far away. But most languages in the world talk about things which flow like a river. Now please remember that, because really the most important part of my talk will be this idea of language flowing like a river, not jerking and stopping and starting, not like that, but something which flows like a river. The famous Oxford English Dictionary, if we look up the word fluent, we find of speech, style, etc., flowing easily and readily from the tongue or pen. So you can be fluent in speech and you can be fluent in writing. Flowing easily. Of a speaker, of a person, so a person can be fluent, ready in the use of words. Ready. That tells us something. It means you've got to be ready. So if someone says to you, you know, what do you like about Turkey? You don't say, I'll go over into the corner, think about it, and I'll come back and tell you in 5 minutes. You have to be, so it's immediate, it's ready in the use of language. Able to express oneself readily and easily. And those are the 2 key words. You have to be ready, and it has to sound easy. So perhaps at this point you're thinking, I should give up my job because my students will never be able to do that. But there are, as I said, important reasons why we should be interested in fluency. Why it matters. Oops. One reason is, of course, examinations. When we give oral examinations, this is one of the criteria, one of the things that we judge in relation to the student's performance. So if we look at the Common European Framework of Reference, the CEFR, and if we look at the B2 level, for example, it says the learner can ideally interact with a degree of fluency and spontaneity that makes regular interaction with native speakers quite possible without strain for either party. And what interests me about that is this notion of either party. So when you're speaking fluently, what you are supposed to be doing is making it easy for the other person, not just for yourself. So it recognizes that there are 2 people involved in a conversation when you are trying to be fluent. So I'm trying to speak fluently, but I'm also trying to do something that makes life easier for you. That's one of the criteria of the Common European Framework of Reference. Another reason why fluency is important is professional and academic life and society in general. Now, there's been some very interesting research done, not by linguists, but by sociologists, who have looked at how well, how successfully or otherwise, people can integrate into communities into which they move, whether as immigrants or, for example, students going to study abroad. And in both cases, immigrants living in a new country and students studying abroad in new contexts, the ability to be fluent is an important part of social integration. To put it simply, if you are an immigrant and you are working in the supermarket, if your colleagues and your bosses perceive, if they see and hear you as a fluent person, you will get a better job. You will become manager of the supermarket. If you are perceived as not fluent, you will probably spend the rest of your life stacking the shelves. You know? So there are important real-world consequences for your ability to be fluent. And it comes down to the other person or persons perceiving you, thinking that you are fluent. So in some ways, what we're looking for is, how can I fool other people? How can I deceive them into thinking that I'm fluent? No, of course, we don't want deception. We want to do it properly and really. But that perception of fluency is very important. That's why I said at the beginning that this is not just an academic question. It's actually something that is important to the people outside, the general public, the people out there, the man and woman in the street, so to speak. Okay, well, let's go back to the examinations, just for a moment. And we'll look at the Common European Framework of Reference, which has 6 levels. I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with it, right? Well, let's just have a quick buzz through it and see what's important about it. Okay, so the first level, basic user, A1, A2. Nice military metaphors there, breakthrough and wastage. Language is seen like a military battle. It's like a war, you know, you're struggling. But you make a breakthrough and then you put your camp down and that's your wastage. The B level, and this is important, at the B level you are supposed to become an independent learner. So the reason for traveling through the B level is to depend less and less on your teachers, on your course books, and to become more dependent upon yourself, to become an independent language learner. Now we have metaphors of travel. You cross a threshold and you reach a vantage point where you can stand and survey the landscape. Isn't it lovely, these metaphors? They're part of how we see language learning. And then when you move to the sea level, you become a proficient user, and the first one there sounds like something that can only have been invented by the American CIA, because it's called effective operational proficiency. It sounds like something that President Nixon might have said in the 1970s. And finally, if you keep on studying, you reach this wonderful gendered, rather perhaps slightly sexist term of mastery. Mastery. You're in full control. So the metaphors for the sea level are metaphors of control. You are in control of the whole situation. You don't need teachers, you don't need course books. You are the person who is directing and controlling everything. So that's how the European system is seen as developing. It's not just learning more language, it's actually changing you as a language animal, as a language person. Okay, that's the idea, that's the theory. In practice, of course, what tends to happen is people just want to learn more language and get more points and more grades and pass examinations. But behind it is this philosophy of development, changing in some way. Now, I said that fluency is an important part of that system, so by the time you reach B2, the idea is you should be fluent. The interesting thing is that if you look at the specifications for C1, it says you should be very fluent. And if you look at the specifications for C2, it says you should be extremely fluent. So the problem is that it seems that even the great scholars, even the great professors of the Council of Europe are not really sure what happens in fluency. You're sort of either more fluent or less fluent. You're very fluent, you're extremely fluent, and who knows, above the sea level, the sky must be the limit. It must be pure heaven to be at the D and the E and the F levels. Absolute heaven. Which probably means that the A level is hell. Now, let's go back then to the academic world. Let's go back to the academic world and see how academics and researchers and scholars have, at the moment, understood fluency. So the conventional criteria. If we read the books and the articles about fluency, what do we find? Well, what do we find? Let's stop for a moment and let's ask you. You're a professional body of teachers. What do you think makes a person fluent? Let's have some answers. Let's be a little bit interactive. And then I should become a tyrant again and take over. But for the moment, I would be interested in hearing some opinions. Anybody? Yes?
You can use discourse markers, fillers. You don't stop in the middle of the conversation.
You don't stop. You can fill silences, and you don't. So again, if someone says, "Why do you like Istanbul?" you don't say. It's beautiful. That would be a very strange behaviour, wouldn't it? And if you did that, if you do that, if someone says, "Why do you like Istanbul?" and you go, they say, "I'm asking you, why do you like Istanbul?" And people get very nervous, very stressed, and they keep talking and talking faster and louder. "Why do you like Istanbul?" So that's obviously very important. In some way, we have to look at how you can maintain this flow. The flow must not stop. That's the first point. Any other points, please? Don't be afraid. This is not a test.
Familiarity with different contexts, knowing the contextual background.
Familiarity with different contexts, knowing where you are and what you're doing and who you're talking to. Yes, that's got to be important. That has to be important indeed, yes. Any others? Yes, sir.
Having practiced the language rules and vocabulary, but not single words, but collocations.
Right, so this is also important. That you need a base, don't you? You need a foundation of some kind of practice in the grammar and the vocabulary. You need to build that foundation. But it's something more than that. It's the ability to put it together, as you say, in the form of collocations and phrases and so on. Yeah, anybody else? One more point and then we'll go on.
You need to be natural.
You need to be natural in some way. You need to sound natural in some way. You need to give the impression that this is something quite easy for you. You don't want people to say, oh my God, she's sweating when she speaks English. That's not the impression you want to give. Because when that happens, people sort of stop the conversation, don't they? They say, well, it was nice meeting you, and they go off and talk to somebody else. Okay. So let's have a look at what the scholars, the researchers, normally say about fluency. Whoops. Just go back one there. First of all, speed of delivery. Everywhere you look in the literature, people talk about speed. Now, the interesting thing about speed is it's very, very relative. Actually, at the moment, I'm speaking incredibly slowly. That's because this is a formal lecture. If we were now sitting having coffee together as friends, and I was talking like this, like, let me tell you about my recent holiday. There were 3 reasons that we chose the hotel. A, it was near the sea. B, it was not very expensive. And C, I had a recommendation. Your friends would very rapidly lose the will to live. And it's a very fast way of losing all your friends. So the point is that speed, it's your point. You have to know the context. You have to know what is appropriate. And in this particular lecture, it's quite appropriate to speak very slowly. If I was speaking, I could speak 10 times faster and I'd get the whole lecture over in 5 minutes and say, okay, that's it, you can all go to your lunch. But it wouldn't be very satisfactory. Conversation, though, is quite fast. Conversation actually places great demands on you. To be natural, as you said, you actually have to speak fairly quickly. I know from my own experience of building corpora, where we've recorded people having natural conversations, that people consume approximately 10,000 words per hour. So 1 hour, 10,000 words. It's quite a lot. It's quite fast. It's much faster than how I'm talking now. So speed of delivery is important, but it is relative to the context. In a job interview, you might want to speak much slower. So if they say, tell us about your experience, you don't say, well, I used to work at McDonald's, but I got fed like that, and then I got a job in the students, and then I went on. Of course not. So it's very context dependent. The second criterion is pauses. We judge people by how long they pause, but above all, where they pause. Okay? And this is the crucial thing. You are allowed to pause. We pause all the time. We stop. But it's where you do it that matters. And I'll give you 2 examples of where you must not do it. And the first is one that was already mentioned, and that is when it is your turn to speak. You have to do something to fill the silence. So if someone says, you know, where did you buy that jacket? You have to say something immediately. It doesn't matter what you say, really. You could say, oh, what, this jacket? Oh, let me think. Oh, yes, I bought it, you know, at a market on the street. What you must not do is, where did you buy that jacket? It's just not allowed. Now, the other place where you must not pause is in the middle of a chunk, in the middle of a collocation. So, if somebody says to you, I saw you talking to John the other day, what were you talking about? You say, oh, nothing special, just this, that, and the other. Yeah? This, that, and the other. It would be very strange to say, oh, nothing special, just this, that, and the other. It sounds bizarre. So your point is a good one. The part of fluency is not pausing in the wrong place. And the most common chunks in the language, well, one of the most common chunks of all is, you know what I mean. And it has to be said very quickly. You know what I mean, you know what I mean, you know what I mean, you know what I mean. And all of those chunks that we like to teach our students must be said in one breath. You mustn't pause in the middle. So again, if someone says, are you coming out tonight? You say, no, I'm rather tired. You know what I mean. It sounds like an offer you can't refuse, doesn't it? So the whole point is you have to say, I'm rather tired. You know what I mean? That's the bad news. You have to say your chunks quickly. The good news is that the rest of your message can be delivered quite slowly. So, are you coming out tonight? No, I'm a little tired. You know what I mean? That's fine. Slow message, fast chunk, fluent. Fast message, fast chunk, fluent. No, I'm rather tired. You know what I mean? Fluent. Fast message, slow chunk, bizarre, strange. No, no, I'm rather tired. You know what. Okay? So there is a lesson there that I think makes your point very strongly, and that is that the putting together of language in collocations and chunks and phrases and idioms has to be done in a particular way in order to be fluent. It's not enough just to learn the chunks. You need to hear them in your head as pieces of music. The good learner constantly rehearses and recites these things in their head, in their minds. And that's one of the ways to become fluent. They're like pieces of music. Disfluencies, that means when communication breaks down, when you stop halfway through a sentence and you don't know what you're going to say next. So this is a question of being coherent, of making your message make sense. And we'll come back to that later. Those are some of the criteria. And the last one is automaticity. That is this readiness to speak immediately and to speak without planning and without thinking. You know, so if someone says, again, why do you like Istanbul? It is rather strange to say, well, I need time to think about that, but I will give you my answer. Just let me go into a corner and think about it. Rather strange. So automaticity, the ability automatically to retrieve language, is fundamental. But I don't think that's enough. I think there are a couple more things that we need to add, which are very practical things, and which I'm going to talk a little bit about now, after I've checked my timing thing here, which these silly iPhones, they demand a password. There we go. Oh, okay, right, about halfway through. I'd like to add the following criteria to what we've already looked at. Now, the first one is your criterion. Can the learner use chunks automatically and accurately? So the most important thing here is your ability to chunk language, to put 3 or 4 words together. Now, you all know that there are hundreds of thousands of chunks in the English language, yeah? Hundreds of thousands of 2-word chunks like, you know, you see, I mean, I think. Hundreds of thousands of 3-word chunks, 4-word chunks, 5-word chunks. What about 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10-word chunks? What about that? Yeah? No. The answer is this is a fundamental feature of language, and it reflects a fundamental feature of the human mind, the brain, if you like. Way back in 1956, looking around the room, I think apart from me, not people were even born in 1956, but in 1956, an American psychologist called Miller published an article called The Magic Rule of 7, give or take 1 each side. And you're probably familiar with this, and that is that the human mind can process bits of information up to about 7 bits. Then after that, it can't process anymore. So if you look at your credit card, for instance, it's got a very, very long number, and the banks have chunked them up into 4s and 3s. If I had more time, there's a lovely little activity which I do where I ask you to write down your credit card number and then give them to me, but that's different. And I always ask for your pin because that's a good example of form. Now this law of 7 is important because it means that most of the chunks in the language are just 2 words or 3 words or 4 words long. It's also important because with technology, with modern software, it enables us to detect plagiarism in universities and schools. If a student copies from another student, if 2 students have the same 12 or 14 words in their composition or in their essay, you can be absolutely sure that one of them has copied from the other. The software that detects this can also then crawl the internet and see if you've got your text from the internet. The only time you can have the same text 15 words long as the student next to you is, I hear music, is, for example, if you are quoting from literature, quoting from Shakespeare or something, then of course you can both have the same 15 words. So this is a fundamental feature of language. It's fundamental to the way the mind works. And to be fluent, we have to be able to control these chunks of 2 words, 3 words, and 4 words, and so on. And we know what they are because we have corpora. So when we were writing Touchstone, it was relatively easy. We just asked the computer to tell us what are the most common chunks in speech. It's not very easy to do it without a corpus. And the reason is that native speakers of the language are not even aware that they are using it. There's a very famous study done by a British linguist called Richard Watts, and he gathered together some of his friends, his educated friends, and he said, I want to record you talking about the English language. And he said, I'd like to ask you this question. What do you think is the current situation of the English language? Is it in a good state or is it in a bad state? And they all said, it's going downhill, it's going down the pan. The beautiful language of Shakespeare is going downhill. And he said, why? And they said, well, it's these young people. They can't say a sentence without saying, you know, or like, or and stuff, or whatever. They're destroying the language. So he said, thank you very much. And he took his recordings, and then he transcribed what these people actually really said. And of course, what they said was, well, you know, it's these young people and whatever, and they're destroying the language and stuff. You know what I mean? So they were using the very things which they criticized because the use of chunks is automatic, unconscious. And that's precisely why they are an important part of fluency, because the native user or the expert users like yourselves don't need to think and to construct them. And so they are so unconscious that you think other people use them, I don't. Other people say, you know, I don't. But of course, you do, you know. Now, this is one that interests me because it's one from my own personal research interest, and that is your ability to link your term smoothly to the previous speakers, using linking words and phrases to create this flow. What I want to show you here, I hope you'll find this interesting, is what computers can tell us about how people link language. It goes back to what we were saying earlier about the fact that you need to be ready immediately. So when somebody else finishes speaking and the nightmare occurs, it's your turn to speak, and the sweat begins to pour, then you have to be ready immediately. But what is it that you need to be ready with? That's the interesting question. What is it that you need to do in order to create that sense of flow?
Associations. Being able to associate, as Paul said.
Don't steal my thunder. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. But again, it's a difficult question to answer from one's own intuition. And I'd like to show you how computers do this. Then the final criterion that I want to add is, can the learner use a repertoire of small interactive words? Words like just, actually, I mean, etc. I don't mean etc. there. I don't mean can the learner use etc. The reason for this criterion is linked to a study that was done in Norway, up there in Scandinavia, by a woman called Angela Hasselgren. And she did a very interesting experiment. Now, don't take this personally, folks. She divided her students into two groups. A group that the teachers and the students themselves considered were fluent. The teacher said, oh yes, these kids, they're really fluent in English. And then, please don't take this personally, a group of students who were considered not fluent, who were struggling with the language, who were not doing well. And she analyzed their spoken language. And she found that with statistical significance, not just randomly, but with statistical significance, the group who were fluent were using words like just and actually. Let me give you an example. I can come to you and say, can I ask you a question? Or I could come to you and say, can I just ask you a question? Can I just ask you a question? Can I just ask you a question? And that little just is proved statistically significantly to alter, to change the perception of the listener. The listener may not do it consciously, but the listener perceives that you are more fluent if you're using these little words. Now, people often say to me, because I write books for Cambridge, there you are, I'm doing my advertising now. Because I write books for Cambridge, they often assume that I live in Cambridge. And people say, so do you live in Cambridge? Now, I don't. I live in a little village about 8 miles outside. Now, I could answer, no, I live outside Cambridge. That's fine. It's fluent, it's correct, it's perfect. But it's kind of a little bit like a courtroom, isn't it? You know? It's a bit like the lawyer or the police interrogation. You can change it fundamentally. Do you live in Cambridge? No, actually, I live in a small village. No, actually, I live in a small village. No, I live in a small village, actually. And as I say, the research has shown that the perception is quite different. You are perceived as being much more fluent if you can use these small words. And Angela Hasselgren, who wrote that study, calls them small words deliberately because they are small. They're so small, we don't notice them. We hardly notice them, but they make a huge difference. They're small words with big meanings. Small words with big consequences. Okie dokie? That's a small word. Let's have a look at these chunks then. Well, you've seen these before. Here are chunks from British English. Here are the top 21, rather bizarrely. Why do I have 21 and not 20? I never noticed that before. Well, there we are. It doesn't matter, does it? And here we have some examples from British English. I don't know, a lot of, I mean, I don't think, one of the, you have to say, you know, I want to, you know what, do you know, a bit of I think it's, but I mean, and it was a couple of, you know, what do you at the moment? So you get the feeling for it. These are the most common chunks in the language. These are the ones that we really need to focus on. And they're all in good courses. Good courses now have them in there. I won't mention the names of any good courses, but I've touched on this point earlier in my talk. If you look at North American English, you find it's very similar. I don't know, a lot of you want to a little bit, what do I think, and I mean, I have to, you have to, you know, I have, I think that, you know what do you want to, I don't know, if you know what, a couple of them, and I was. This is very, very similar. It's not particularly a British phenomenon, it's not even an English phenomenon. Any language in the world will have these chunks. And notice what they're all about. They're all about interacting with you. It's you and me, it's you know, and I think, and I mean, and it's things that make things vague, like a couple of, a little bit of. Why on earth should we want to be vague all the time? Well, it comes back to your point. The vaguer you sound, the more natural you sound. Strangely enough, strangely enough. Let me demonstrate that to you. In our corpus at my university at Nottingham, we have two students talking. And they're planning an evening for someone who is coming to visit for the weekend. They said, what should we do with her? You know, Friday evening, should we go out? What should we do? And one student says, I know, we can take her to the pub. And there's a very famous pub in Nottingham which claims to be the oldest pub in England. We can take her to the pub. And the other student says, she doesn't drink alcohol. And the other one says, that's okay, she can have a Coke or something. That's okay, she can have a Coke or something. What does or something mean there? What does it mean? Oh, tell me. An alternative. So she could have yak's milk, yeah? Or a bowl of soup, or a camel, or a house brick. Yeah? No, of course it doesn't mean just anything. It's not open-ended. We know exactly what it means, don't we? No, it doesn't mean absolutely anything, does it? She can have a Coke or something. What does it mean? Something similar. Any other soft drink. It excludes alcohol. And you know from your culture, if you are British, that it excludes a glass of milk. You don't go into a pub in England and say, oh, a glass of milk, please. Everybody would stop talking and rather puzzled. So these are cultural references. When we say a Coke or something, we are saying, you and I have the same view of the world. We share the same culture. We know exactly what a Coke or something means. Now, the important thing is that it would be ridiculous, it would be absurd if the student said, that's okay, she can have a Coke or a Diet Coke or a Pepsi or a Diet Pepsi, she can have Coke, she can have lemonade, she can have chestnut, she can have mango juice, she can have apple juice, she can have water, she can have mineral water, she can have sparkling water, she can have still water. To go through the whole list of possibilities would be absurd, and again, a way of losing all your friends very rapidly. The other alternative, and that is to be precise, is equally strange. Oh, she doesn't drink alcohol. That's okay, she can have a Coke. And if she doesn't like Coke, she can go home. So the alternatives to being vague, neither of them is natural. The only natural way to communicate is to express yourself vaguely. If you meet a friend in town, oh, you've been shopping? What have you been buying? Well, you know, I've just moved into my new flat and I've been buying some plates and cups and things. Do you say to your friend, why are you being vague? Why are you being so vague? Tell me what you're doing. Are you trying to deceive me in some way? I don't like you. You're being very deliberately vague. Of course not. This is the most natural, normal way of communicating. We see it in these chunks, a couple of. What does a couple of mean? It means sort of 2 or 3, but it doesn't mean 28 or 1. But this is the heart of naturalness and fluency, these chunks. Okay, time is running out, but I want to show you now just one more phenomenon here. This connection, this ability to connect terms. Getting your turn right. Fluency includes, obviously, the ability to construct a good term when it's your turn to speak. You mustn't break down and be disfluent. And to link it smoothly to other people's turns, creating conflicts. How you start your turn is important, and this relates to research done in the United States by a very good Chinese linguist who I worked with for some time when I lived in the States, a man called Hongyin Tao, the University of, he's right now at the University of Southern California. The first words that you speak when it's your turn to speak show your reaction to what you hear. This Chinese linguist Tao showed that turn openers, what he called turn openers, the first word or words that you speak when it's your turn, primarily attend to what the previous speaker has just said. So this brings us to a very simple, basic rule of fluency. If you forget everything I've said here in this room today, just remember this one thing. It's a perfect golden rule. It's easy to teach. It transforms people's fluency. When it is your turn to speak, first of all, show your reaction to what you've just heard before you say what you want to say. So that's the rule. Say something about what you've just heard, then say what you want to say. Now, it sounds so simple, you might say, did he come all the way to Turkey to tell us that? Well, the answer is yes. Yes. And the reason is that it is so simple, but we ignore it. My own experience in the classroom is that when you get students in pair work or you're asking them questions, they get into such a high stress, they're thinking, oh my God, it's my turn to speak next, what am I going to say? And they don't engage with each other. That's what's often missing. That is the one thing that's missing. This ability to say something about what the other person has just said before you say what you want to say. Now, what is that something which you say? Well, it could be something very simple. I'm going to show you now what we find if we look at our corpus of British English and we ask the computer, tell us what is the first word that people say when it's their turn to speak. Don't worry, I'll read it out to you. Here they are. Yeah, I, and oh, no, well, but you, so yes, it's right. The. Now, why should we get excited about this? Well, I'm going to show you in the last few minutes why we should. I'm going to take two of them, well and right, because they're very, very common. And I'm going to show you something about these words. There's an example of well and right, very common. They're very common as what we call turn openers. Well, stuff like, oh, right, well. So we're doing this all the time. When we start to speak, we use words like well and right. Go back to the question I'm often asked. Do you live in Cambridge? I often reply, well, near Cambridge. Well, near Cambridge. And the reason I say well is because you've asked me a yes-no question, but I can't answer it as a yes-no question. I have to indicate to you that I'm going to answer it in some different way. And that's what well is for. Now, if we ask the computer to show us the behavior of well and right, this is what the computer shows us. Now, I want you to see here, these numbers here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the first word you say when you open your mouth. That's the second word, the third word, the fourth word, the fifth word, etc., etc. The computer, with ease and aplomb, can tell us what people do. Hundreds of thousands of speakers, what they do. These are the patterns for well and right. Both of them love to be the first word. They're very happy. They're happiest when they are the first word you say. They're not so happy to be anywhere else. Okay? They don't like being anywhere else. They like to be word number one. And oh is even more. Oh can't stand being anywhere else other than the first word. So if someone says, I've just won $1 million on the lottery, you don't say, right, actually, oh! It's almost, oh, really? Not really, oh! Okay? Now these things, I hope to show you, will become very important. Let's have a look at another. Have I got time? How am I doing? You probably want me to shut up, don't you? I think I've got about 1.5 minutes left. I'll just show you another one here. This is the word basically, which is very frequently found at the beginning of speakers' turns. Basically, it's when you want to say, I'm not going to tell you a long, long story, I'm just going to give you the main details. Basically, you know, why didn't you go out last night? Well, basically, I had no money. Okay, so it's a way of making something short. Now, if we ask the computer to show us the behavior of basically, this is what we get. You know, isn't it? So basically, actually, seems to love to be word number 2. Doesn't particularly, I mean, it is often word number 1, but its favourite place is word number 2. Why?
Well.
Because it's being kicked out by more powerful words, like well and right. In our corpus of 5 million words, we find thousands of examples of well, basically, and so basically. We don't find any examples of basically well, or basically so. What this tells us is that there is a hierarchy at the beginning of terms. There is a pecking order, like in the hen house. There are some words that are more powerful than others. Some words demand to be the first word you say. Others are quite happy to be the second or the third word. And when we look at our corpus, this is I spend hours, days, months, years looking at computer screens like this. Now I know you were sitting there thinking, he should get out more, he should get a life. But I find it quite fascinating. I find it quite fascinating. And this is a concordance lines for the word basically. Each line is somebody speaking the word basically. And you can see that sometimes it's the first word they use, but mostly it's pushed out by words like so, and well, and yeah. Okay, so it likes to be the second word. And we can say the same for other words. We can say the same for the word actually. It's very happy to be second word. Well, actually, yes, actually, so actually. We never, ever find actually well. Not in millions and millions of words in English do we find actually well. It's always well, actually, so actually, but actually. Not actually, but. Actually, and. Now this tells us something important. It tells us that the beginning of the turn is actually structure. It has structure. It has structure that is repeated time and time, hundreds, thousands of times. The structure of a turn is just as powerful as the structure of a sentence, as the grammatical structure of a sentence, or as the vocabulary structure of a collocation or a chunk. So we're saying this is something real, it's something we can prove with the computer, it's something we can put into the teaching materials. And if we can have the right kinds of activities, controlled practice, as you said yourself, sir, you have to start off really with a solid basis, then you can slowly move towards freer practice. What you will do is transform the perception of listeners as to how fluent you are. It actually makes a huge difference. But I'm going to end on one last little point. The more observant amongst you will have noticed in the list of the top 20 or whatever it was, turn openers, that the was the last one. So the interesting question is, how come the most common word in the entire language doesn't like to be at the beginning of a speaker's turn? How come? Why don't we? If we looked at written language, we would find millions of sentences that begin with the. Millions of them. But we look at spoken language and we do not find many terms that begin with the. Now, of course, sometimes we will. If the house is on fire, we don't say, well, actually, right, okay, the house is on fire, run. No, of course, you might run in and say, the house is on fire, the house is on fire. But generally speaking, we don't like to begin our turns with the. Why not?
I think you just answered that. When you express to someone the house is on fire, it's a very one-directional exchange.
Yes.
Whereas in a conversation, we need these little words to show the communal nature.
I promise you I didn't pay him to say that.
Well, actually...
I mean, you've made the point beautifully, and that is that the definite article the is not an interactive word. It's not a bridging word. It doesn't create that bridge with what the other person has just said. It can refer backwards to things, but it doesn't provide that interactive bridge with what the other person has said. Now, of course, sometimes we do start turns with the. There are hundreds of them, but when you look at them, you find that they are chunks with the, such as the thing is. The problem is, the only trouble is, that's when we find the at the beginning. And these are very interactive chunks. They are doing things for the other person. But the definite article alone is powerless. It has no power to create that interactiveness, that flow. So I'm going to stop there. What I hope I've shown you is that understanding fluency can be greatly assisted by using the power of computers and corpora. That it is not just an academic or technological interest, It is something that we can put into our teaching materials, and most importantly of all, it is something that has consequences out there in the real world. Thank you very much for listening.